If that engine stays dead for 5 more minutes, this carrier becomes a floating coffin for the mission. That was the sentence Commander Ethan Brooks heard from Fleet Command as sweat rolled down his neck in the freezing control room of the USS Liberty. The aircraft carrier, one of the most advanced warships in the United States Navy, sat completely still in the Pacific Ocean, nearly 180 miles off the California coast, unable to move. The emergency deployment clock was ticking. In less than 30 minutes, Liberty was supposed to join a classified naval exercise involving 3 destroyers and 2 submarines. Missing the launch window was not an option. Ethan stared at the engine status board, his jaw tight. 4 massive gas turbines, each capable of pushing the 97,000-ton ship across the ocean at over 30 knots, were dead. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Just dead. No ignition. No startup cycle. No pressure build. And nobody understood why. Run the diagnostics again, Ethan snapped. Chief Engineer Mark Holloway shook his head. That's the 4th time, sir. Same error. Fuel synchronization failure. Ethan clenched his fists. Then override it. Already tried. Around them, 15 engineers worked frantically, tapping screens, checking valves, rerouting systems, and pulling technical manuals. The room buzzed with tension. Every second felt expensive. Every minute burned taxpayer money and military credibility. Fleet Command was already calling every 3 minutes. Ethan hated this feeling. He was 34 years old, one of the youngest operations commanders ever assigned to a carrier, known for his precision, speed, and confidence. He built his career on solving problems fast. But right now, in front of his entire crew, he had nothing. A loud metallic hum vibrated through the lower deck, followed by silence. Another failed ignition attempt. Ethan slammed his hand against the steel console. Come on! Outside, sailors moved faster, whispers spreading across the deck. Something was wrong. Badly wrong. The Liberty was supposed to be the pride of the Pacific Fleet. Instead, it looked helpless. Down the portside deck, 72-year-old Walter Hayes stood quietly beside his grandson, Seaman First Class Ryan Hayes, who had invited him aboard for Family Naval Heritage Day. Walter wore an old brown jacket and carried himself like any retired grandfather. Thick around the waist, gray-haired, slow steps. Nothing about him stood out. At least not at first. Ryan looked embarrassed as alarms echoed through the ship. Bad timing for a visit, Grandpa. Walter didn't answer. He tilted his head, listening. His eyes narrowed. That sound. Ryan blinked. What sound? Walter kept listening to the faint, failed spool-up vibration. That startup sequence is wrong. Ryan laughed nervously. Grandpa, these engines are more advanced than anything back in your day. Walter looked toward the engine deck, his expression unreadable. Son, steel still talks the same way it did 50 years ago. Before Ryan could respond, another failed ignition alarm blared across the ship. Walter's eyes hardened. Whatever was happening down there, he already knew it wasn't normal. Commander Ethan Brooks stood frozen for half a second after the latest alarm, then forced himself back into motion. Again, he barked. I want every valve, every line, every relay checked. We do not miss this deployment. Chief Engineer Mark Holloway wiped grease from his hands and leaned over the digital schematic. Sir, we have already run the startup cycle 5 times. The system keeps shutting itself down at fuel pressure equalization. Ethan stared at the screen. The numbers looked perfect. Fuel levels were stable. Pressure lines were clear. Ignition systems were responding. On paper, there was no reason the engines should fail. That was the worst kind of problem. The invisible kind. Another engineer stepped forward. We tried rerouting the ignition sequence through backup systems. Same result. Ethan exhaled hard. 22 minutes left. Fleet Command called again. The speaker crackled. Commander Brooks, report. Ethan swallowed his frustration. Still diagnosing, sir. The voice on the line turned colder. This exercise involves over $3 billion in coordinated naval movement. If Liberty misses the launch, the entire chain collapses. The line went dead. Ethan looked around at his crew. Nobody spoke. He could feel the pressure in the room changing. It was no longer about fixing engines. It was about blame. Outside on deck, sailors whispered as rumors spread faster than the ocean wind. Some said software corruption. Others said sabotage. Walter Hayes stood near the railing, arms folded, listening to the ship itself. Ryan glanced at him. "Grandpa, seriously, how can you tell something from one sound?" Walter kept his eyes forward. "Because machines talk before they break. Most people stop listening." Ryan smiled awkwardly. "Things are different now." Walter nodded slowly. "That is what every generation says." Down below, Ethan made a decision. "Call in the advanced systems team." Within minutes, 3 civilian contractors from the ship's embedded technical unit arrived. These were specialists trained on the newest propulsion software. If anyone could solve it, it would be them. For the next 10 minutes, they tore through every digital layer of the system. They checked code, synchronization tables, pressure mapping, and thermal balancing. Nothing. One of them finally shook his head. "Sir, this is not software." Ethan stared at him. "Then what is it?" The man hesitated. "It feels mechanical. Old school mechanical." Ethan almost laughed at the idea. This carrier was packed with 21st century technology. Mechanical failure on something this advanced sounded ridiculous. Another failed startup rattled the deck. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise. On the upper deck, Walter turned his head sharply toward the engine bay. His eyes narrowed. "There," he said quietly. Ryan frowned. "What?" Walter pointed toward the lower hull. "That hesitation before the cutoff. It is bleeding pressure before ignition." Ryan looked confused. "How do you even know that?" Walter looked at him for a long moment. "Because I have heard it before." Ryan laughed under his breath. "Grandpa, nobody down there can figure this out. These are the best engineers in the Navy." Walter straightened his jacket and started walking toward the engine access hatch. "Then maybe they are looking in the wrong century." Walter Hayes moved with surprising purpose for a man his age, stepping down the steel stairs toward the lower engineering deck while Ryan hurried behind him. The closer they got, the louder the tension became. Radios crackled. Boots pounded against metal floors. Engineers rushed past carrying tools and diagnostic tablets. The entire lower level felt like a machine trying to save itself. Ryan grabbed Walter's arm. "Grandpa, you cannot just walk into engineering. This is restricted." Walter kept moving. "Then stop following me if you are worried." Before Ryan could argue, they reached the sealed engine control room. Through the glass, Commander Ethan Brooks was pacing like a man trapped inside a clock that was running out of time. Walter watched for only a few seconds before knocking once on the steel frame. Ethan turned annoyed. "Who let civilians down here?" Ryan straightened. "Sir, I am sorry. This is my grandfather. He was just visiting." Ethan's eyes landed on Walter. 72 years old. Heavyset. Gray hair. Worn boots. Nothing impressive. Nothing useful. "This is an active military emergency," Ethan said sharply. "Get him out." Walter did not move. His eyes drifted past Ethan and locked onto the engine status display. Fuel synchronization error. Pressure bleed fluctuation. Walter's face changed. Not fear. Recognition. "Your pressure equalization valve is leaking during startup," Walter said calmly. The room went silent for a second, then several engineers exchanged confused looks. Ethan crossed his arms. "Excuse me?" Walter pointed toward the lower panel. "There is a pressure bleed before ignition lock. It is not software. It is mechanical." One of the civilian specialists frowned. "That is impossible. Those valves are self-regulating." Walter looked at him. "Then your self-regulating system is failing." A few younger sailors laughed quietly. Ethan gave a short smile, the kind people gave when humoring someone they thought was lost. Sir, with all due respect, you are not part of this crew. Walter nodded. No. But I know what I heard. Ethan shook his head. You've heard a failed startup sequence from 3 decks away and diagnosed it? Walter looked him in the eye. Yes. That made the room chuckle louder. Ethan rubbed his temples. 16 minutes left. He did not have time for this. Listen, Grandpa, Ethan said, his tone sharp enough for everyone to hear. We have the best propulsion engineers in the Navy and civilian contractors who built these systems. I do not need guesses from a tourist. Ryan looked embarrassed. Grandpa, maybe we should go. But Walter did not move. Instead, he stepped closer to the display and stared at the startup graph. His eyes scanned the curve once. Then he asked a question that froze the room. Why is your auxiliary pressure bleed sequence running at 7.2 instead of 6.8? Mark Holloway looked up fast. His face changed. Wait, how do you know that sequence? Walter did not answer. Ethan noticed Holloway's reaction. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. But before he could speak, another failed ignition alarm blasted through the room. Walter looked at Ethan and said quietly, You have less than 10 minutes before that system locks itself completely. The engine room fell into a strange silence after Walter spoke. Even the hum of backup systems seemed quieter. Chief Engineer Mark Holloway stared at the old man, trying to process the question. The auxiliary pressure bleed sequence was buried deep in the startup protocol, something most crew members never even saw. Commander Ethan Brooks noticed the hesitation in Holloway's face and his patience snapped. What is he talking about? Mark swallowed. Sir, the auxiliary bleed sequence does run at 7.2 during the startup cycle. Ethan frowned. And? Mark hesitated. And it was designed to run at 6.8 on the original framework. The room shifted. One of the civilian specialists stepped forward. That protocol was modified 15 years ago during modernization. Walter nodded once. And that modification is forcing a premature pressure release before full ignition lock. The specialist laughed under his breath. That is not how this system works. Walter looked at him. Then your system is failing exactly how I said? Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated the way this was going. A civilian old man standing in his engine room, speaking like he belonged there, while his own experts looked uncertain. It felt like losing control. He could not allow that. Enough, Ethan said. This is not a guessing contest. Walter folded his arms. It is not guessing. Ethan took a step closer. Then what is it? Walter met his eyes without blinking. Experience. That answer made a few sailors laugh again. One younger crewman standing by the far wall quietly raised his phone and started recording. Another muttered, This old guy thinks he can out-engineer the Navy. More snickers followed. Ryan felt his face burn. Grandpa, please. Let us just go. Walter ignored him. Ethan looked around the room and made sure everyone heard him. Listen carefully. This ship carries over 5,000 personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. I will not risk it because some retired mechanic thinks he heard something. Walter's expression stayed calm. Retired mechanic? Ethan shrugged. That what you are? Walter almost smiled, but said nothing. Another failed startup attempt shook the room. The entire deck vibrated hard, followed by that same sharp pressure drop Walter had mentioned. He tilted his head slightly, listening again. There it is. Ethan threw up his hands. There what is? Walter pointed at the pressure graph. The bleed is hitting 2 seconds too early. Mark looked at the monitor, then froze. The graph showed exactly that. 2.1 seconds early. His eyes widened. Sir? Ethan turned. What? Mark spoke carefully. He is right. The room went silent again. The younger sailor stopped laughing. Ethan looked at the graph, then at Walter. His pride fought with logic. There were 9 minutes left. Fleet Command called again. The screen flashed red. Ethan answered. Status? Came the voice. Ethan hesitated. For the first time all day, he did not know what to say. Walter stepped closer to the engine console and spoke quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. You can keep protecting your pride, or you can save your ship. Ethan stared at him. For the first time, the old man did not look ordinary at all. Commander Ethan. Brooks held the fleet command line in silence for 2 long seconds before finally speaking. We are still working the problem, sir. The voice on the other end was colder now. You have 8 minutes. If that carrier does not move, your command record will carry this failure permanently. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the receiver slowly. The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Around him, every eye was waiting. Not for orders. For answers. He looked at Walter Hayes, the old man standing calmly beside the console like none of this chaos touched him. Ethan hated it. Hated that this stranger had been right twice. Hated that his own engineers had nothing better. Fine, Ethan said at last. Talk. Walter stepped toward the display. His voice stayed low and steady. Your auxiliary pressure bleed is firing before the ignition lock seals. That is draining startup pressure before the turbines can catch. One of the civilian specialists folded his arms. That system is automated. It cannot do that without showing a fault. Walter looked at him. It is showing a fault. You just do not know how to read it. The room stiffened. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then explain it. Walter pointed at the pressure curve. See that dip right there? 2 seconds before ignition? That is not random. That is a bleed valve hesitating. Mark Holloway leaned in closer. That would explain the fuel imbalance. Walter nodded. And if you keep forcing startups, you will hard-lock the ignition chamber. Mark looked at Ethan. Sir, if that happens, we could be stuck for 12 hours. Ethan's stomach tightened. 12 hours meant disaster. The operation would collapse. Careers would end. Walter looked at the lower deck schematic. Where is access panel 14? Mark blinked. Panel 14? Walter nodded. Starboard side, lower engine bay. Mark stared at him. That panel was removed from all digital maps 20 years ago. Walter looked up. But it is still there. The room went dead silent. Even Ethan felt it now. This was no lucky guess. Ryan stared at his grandfather like he was seeing him for the first time. Ethan crossed his arms. Who exactly are you? Walter ignored the question. You do not have time for introductions. Another warning alarm flashed. 7 minutes left. Mark swallowed hard. Sir, if he is right, manual access to panel 14 could bypass the bleed valve. Ethan looked between Mark and Walter. And if he is wrong? Mark hesitated. Then we lose the last 6 minutes. Ethan rubbed his face, pressure crushing down on him. The younger sailors who had laughed earlier were silent now. Nobody was smiling. Walter stepped toward the hatch. I can fix it. Ethan stared at him. In how long? Walter looked back. 5 minutes. That answer made one of the specialists scoff. Impossible. Walter gave him a flat look. No. Impossible is thinking software can fix steel. Ethan looked at the clock. 6 minutes, 43 seconds. He had one choice left. Trust the old man, or watch the mission die. Commander Ethan Brooks stared at the countdown clock on the wall. 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Every instinct in him screamed not to trust this old stranger, but every trained engineer in the room had already failed. He looked at Chief Engineer Mark Holloway. Can he reach panel 14? Mark nodded slowly. If it is still there. Walter gave a quiet breath through his nose. It is there. Ethan hesitated for one final second, then stepped aside. Do it. Walter did not waste time. He walked straight toward the lower hatch like he had been inside this ship 100 times before. Ryan followed, stunned. Mark grabbed a flashlight and hurried after him. 2 civilian specialists stayed behind, still shaking their heads. One muttered. "This is insane." Walter reached the lower engine bay and stopped in front of a smooth steel wall covered in newer reinforcement plating. To everyone else, it looked solid. He ran his hand across the metal, feeling along the seams. Then he tapped twice in one exact spot. Hollow. Mark's eyes widened. "No way." Walter looked at him. "There used to be a hidden maintenance cutout here." Mark pointed. "Used to be?" Walter gave him a faint smile. "Unless somebody moved physics." Mark quickly grabbed a tool and removed 4 bolts from the reinforced plate. Behind it was an old sealed panel. Panel 14. Covered in dust. Untouched for decades. Ryan stared. "How did you know?" Walter did not answer. He knelt down slowly, opened the panel, and exposed a maze of manual fuel relays and pressure bypass lines. The kind of hardware nobody trained on anymore. Above them, the failed startup warning sounded again. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Walter listened carefully. Not to the alarms. To the metal. To the pulse of trapped pressure moving wrong through the lines. Then he reached for one small brass valve. Mark frowned. "That valve is not even listed in our active schematics." Walter nodded. "Because your schematics are younger than this engine." He adjusted the valve by less than half an inch. Then he pressed his fingers against the pipe, feeling the vibration. "There." He turned to Mark. "Reset ignition manually. Sequence 4-1. Mark froze. "That sequence was retired 38 years ago." Walter looked at him. "And yet here we are." Mark rushed to the manual override station and entered the sequence. Up in the control room, Ethan watched the screens, heart pounding. One of the civilian specialists scoffed. "Nothing is going to happen." Then the pressure graph changed. Stable. For the first time all day. Ethan leaned forward. "What?" Down below, Walter adjusted the valve one last fraction. "Now." Mark hit ignition. For one long second, nothing. Then the deck shook. A deep roar thundered through the hull as Turbine 1 ignited cleanly. Then Turbine 2. Then 3. Then 4. The entire carrier trembled with life. Lights across the room turned green. Pressure perfect. Fuel locked. Full power restored. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. Around him, engineers stood frozen. No cheers. No words. Just shock. On the lower deck, Walter slowly stood up and wiped his hands clean. Ryan could barely speak. "Grandpa, what did you just do?" Walter looked at the waking engine with calm eyes. "I reminded it how it was built." For 3 full seconds after the turbines came alive, nobody moved. The sound filled every steel corridor of the ship like thunder rolling through a mountain valley. The control room screens glowed green across the board. Pressure stable. Fuel balanced. Ignition locked. Full propulsion restored. Commander Ethan Brooks stared at the display like it was speaking a language he no longer understood. Chief Engineer Mark Holloway's hands were still frozen over the console. One of the civilian specialists stepped back, pale, shaking his head. That should not have worked." Ethan looked at him sharply. "But it did." Across the carrier, the giant vessel began to move. Slowly at first. Then stronger. Water churned behind the massive propellers as the Liberty pushed forward into the Pacific, exactly 7 minutes before its deployment window closed. Fleet Command called again. Ethan answered immediately. "Status?" came the voice. Ethan looked at the green board and swallowed. "Engines restored. Carrier moving. Mission back on schedule." There was silence on the line. Then one sentence. "How?" Ethan did not know what to say. He looked toward the lower deck. "I will explain later, sir." He hung up. For the first time all day, the room exploded into motion. Sailors rushed to their stations. Orders flew. Systems came online. The crisis was over. But the bigger question had just begun. Ethan walked fast toward the lower engine bay, Mark close behind him. When they arrived, Walter Hayes was calmly closing panel 14 like he had just finished changing a light bulb in his garage. Ryan stood beside him, still stunned. Mark spoke first. That sequence. Nobody alive on this ship should know that sequence. Walter stood up slowly. Some things are easier to remember than to forget. Ethan stared at the old man. Just an hour ago he had mocked him in front of everyone. Called him a tourist. A retired mechanic. Now that same man had saved the entire operation in less than 5 minutes. Ethan's pride twisted in his chest. Who taught you that system? Walter looked at him. I did not learn it. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Before Walter could answer, a voice came over the shipwide speaker. Attention all senior officers. Rear Admiral Benjamin Cole is boarding immediately. Mark's eyes widened. The Admiral? Ethan looked confused. Why would he be boarding now? Mark gave him a look. Because this kind of failure and recovery gets attention fast. 20 minutes later, the Liberty was fully underway and steady. On the main deck, officers lined up as Rear Admiral Cole stepped aboard. A tall man in his 60s, sharp-eyed, serious. He walked straight toward Ethan. Commander Brooks. I want a full explanation. Ethan began. Sir, we had a mechanical pressure bleed failure and... He stopped. Walter was walking across the deck with Ryan, heading toward the visitor exit point. Admiral Cole's eyes landed on him. He froze. His expression changed instantly. Confusion. Recognition. Then disbelief. That cannot be, he whispered. Ethan noticed. Sir? Admiral Cole took 2 steps forward, staring at Walter Hayes like he had seen a ghost from another lifetime. And for the first time that day, Walter looked slightly uncomfortable. Rear Admiral Benjamin Cole walked past Commander Ethan Brooks without saying another word, his eyes locked on Walter Hayes. The entire deck seemed to slow as officers and sailors watched the strange moment unfold. Walter stopped near the visitor railing, his hand resting on the steel. He knew that look. He had seen it before. Recognition mixed with disbelief. Admiral Cole stopped 3 feet in front of him. For a second, either man spoke. Then the Admiral gave a small, stunned laugh. Walter Hayes. Ryan looked between them, confused. Ethan stepped closer, trying to understand. Sir, you know him? Admiral Cole turned, his expression sharp. Know him? He looked back at Walter. This man wrote half the emergency propulsion protocols the Navy still uses. The words hit the deck like a shockwave. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Mark Holloway went pale. Even the civilian specialists looked stunned. Walter sighed like he had hoped to avoid this. Benjamin, you always did talk too much. Admiral Cole smiled. And you always hated attention. Ethan stared at Walter. Wait, you are telling me he worked on this system? Admiral Cole's face hardened. Worked on it? He designed the original emergency bypass architecture for the Liberty-class carriers. 40 years ago. Ethan looked like someone had punched a hole through his understanding of the day. Suddenly every impossible detail made sense. The hidden panel. The retired ignition sequence. The valve no one else recognized. Walter had not guessed anything. He knew the ship because pieces of it existed because of him. Ryan's mouth was still open. Grandpa, you built this? Walter looked at him quietly. Part of it. Admiral Cole folded his arms. More than part. Back then, they called him the best propulsion engineer in the fleet. One of the younger sailors who had laughed earlier slowly lowered his head. Ethan felt heat rise in his face. Every word he had said to Walter replayed in his mind. Tourist. Retired mechanic. Stay out of this. The humiliation hit hard now, but in reverse. Mark looked at Walter with deep respect. Sir, why did you leave? Walter was quiet for a moment. The ocean wind moved through the deck. Because one day I realized machines are easier than people. Machines break for reasons. People break for pride. Nobody answered. Admiral Cole looked at Ethan. Commander, do you understand what almost happened today? Ethan swallowed. Yes, sir. Cole shook his head. No. You almost ignored the one man on this ocean who could have saved your ship in time. Ethan could not deny it. Walter started walking again, ready to leave. He had no interest in praise. No interest in explanation. But before he could reach the exit point, Fleet Command radioed directly to the deck. Admiral Cole, urgent update. The Liberty's emergency bypass logs just confirmed manual activation by original creator credentials. Ethan froze. Creator credentials? Cole looked at Walter, then smiled. Looks like the ship remembers you too. For the first time all day, every person on that deck understood exactly who Walter Hayes really was. The deck stayed silent long after Fleet Command confirmed the creator credentials. The ocean wind moved through rows of sailors, but nobody spoke. Walter Hayes stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking more like a tired grandfather than the man who had just saved a warship worth billions of dollars. Commander Ethan Brooks felt smaller than he had in his entire career. Just 1 hour earlier, he had laughed at Walter, dismissed him, and treated him like a burden. Now every man and woman on deck knew the truth. Rear Admiral Benjamin Cole stepped back and looked at Ethan. There are moments in command that define who you become. This is one of them. Ethan nodded, but his throat was tight. He knew exactly what the Admiral meant. Pride had nearly cost him everything. Slowly, Ethan walked toward Walter. Every eye on the ship followed him. Ryan watched nervously. Mark Holloway stood still, arms crossed, waiting. When Ethan reached Walter, he stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in front of the full crew, he straightened his posture and saluted. It was sharp, formal, and real. The kind of salute given only with respect. Walter looked at him quietly. Ethan lowered his hand and spoke, his voice clear enough for everyone to hear. Mr. Hayes, I was wrong. I judged you before I knew who you were. And because of that, I almost lost this ship. I owe you my apology, and my thanks. The words hung in the air. No one expected them. Especially not from Ethan Brooks. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod. That is the thing about engines, Commander. They do not care how young or proud you are. They only respond to truth. Ethan swallowed hard. That sentence hit deeper than any order ever had. Walter looked around at the crew, at the massive steel machine roaring across the Pacific, and then at his grandson. Ryan still looked stunned. You never told me any of this, Ryan said. Walter smiled faintly. Because the work mattered more than the story. Admiral Cole laughed softly. That has always been Walter. One of the young sailors who had recorded Walter earlier stepped forward awkwardly. Sir, I am sorry for laughing. Walter waved it off. That is how people learn. They laugh first. Then life teaches them better. A few sailors smiled. The tension finally broke. For the first time all day, the deck felt lighter. Ethan looked at Walter. Fleet Command would want to honor you. Maybe bring you in as a consultant. Walter chuckled. No. I am too old for meetings. Even Ethan laughed at that. Walter started walking toward the exit ramp with Ryan beside him. Before stepping off, he stopped and looked back at Ethan one last time. Next time your ship talks, listen. Then he walked away. The Liberty cut through the Pacific at full speed, its engines stronger than ever. But for Ethan Brooks, the real repair that day was not inside the steel. It was inside himself. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson does not come from rank, youth, or technology. Sometimes it comes from an old man everyone thought was finished, until he reminded them what experience sounds like.